The river glowed in the hush of dusk, its surface turning to molten copper under the dying sun. A girl stood barefoot at its edge, her dress hem damp with water and her face set toward the horizon. Her voice rose soft at first, almost a whisper carried by the breeze, and then it spread across the valley like firelight chasing darkness. She sang of things no one dared speak aloud, of fathers who rode away and never came back, of homes burned until only smoke remained, of the fragile longing that lived in hearts too proud to confess it. Her voice was not entertainment. It was confession, it was memory, and it was warning. Even the crickets still when she sang, as though the land itself was listening. People gathered in the shadows, not too close to her, as if afraid of breaking whatever spell her voice cast. Farmers with callous hands leaned against their tired mules. Mothers hushed their children, and men who carried rifles as naturally as breaths stood silent with hats pressed against their chests. They did not cheer. They did not applaud. When she finished, they only stood a while longer, carrying the weight of her song back into cracked bones of their village. That was when he came. The rider appeared at the edge of the dirt road as the last notes fell quiet. He was dust-stained, slouched in the saddle, his horse thin but stubborn. The people shifted, their eyes sharp with suspicion. Strangers never came to this village unless they brought trouble with them. He dismounted without hurry, boots heavy on the earth, and lingered just outside the circle of listeners. His face was roughened by travel and shadowed by weariness. His gaze the kind that had seen too much and spoken too little. When the girl turned her head slightly and her eyes caught his, the moment was so brief it might have been imagined. But in that glance he felt what the others had felt, her song opening wounds he thought long buried. The villagers noticed his hand hovering near the worn revolver at his hip. Habit, not threat, but they read it as both. A man whispered to another that he'd seen such a face once, years ago, on a crumpled poster nailed to a sheriff's wall. The memory carried the tang of bounty and blood. Still, no one stepped forward. They waited, letting the silence stretch thin and taut. The girl broke it first. She asked the stranger if he had come seeking the river song. Her words were not coy but plain, the way one might speak to wind. He answered only that he had heard it from a road, and that it reminded him of something lost. She did not press. She turned back to the water, her reflection trembling in the ripples, and said that the river carried many voices if one listened carefully. The stranger lowered his head, as though ashamed of what he might hear. Night crept in with a chill, and the villagers drifted away to their cabins of warped wood and smoking lanterns. The stranger remained by the bank, staring at the water. His horse stamped its hooves, restless. The girl lingered as well, humming under her breath, weaving fragments of melody not meant for crowd. Her songs felt different when the world wasn't watching, raw, stripped of the weight she carried for others. He asked her then why she sang when every note seemed carved from her own sorrow. She replied that if she stopped, those she had lost would vanish entirely. She sang to remember, and to keep their names alive even when her lips never spoke them. The stranger said nothing more, but his shoulders slumped, and for the first time that day he looked smaller than the gun he carried. The village beyond the riverbank was worn thin by years of drought and fear. Wells ran shallow, roofs sagged under neglect, and the soil resisted seed. Men guarded their cattle like they expected raiders each night, and children played in dust rather than fields. Survival had hardened them, stripped away their laughter until only suspicion remained. They saw every newcomer as a risk, and this stranger, quiet, scarred, unreadable, looked like a storm waiting to break. Still, there was something in the way he lingered, listening to the girl's voice as though it held him together. He stood apart from the villagers, but not against them. The river caught the sound of her humming, carrying it downstream until it vanished into the dark. When the lanterns dimmed and the night grew heavy, the stranger saddled his horse again. He did not leave. Instead, he led the animal a little ways from the bank and made camp beneath a crooked tree. The fire he built was small, enough to keep the chill off, but not enough to call attention. He ate in silence, eyes fixed on the shifting shadows beyond the flames. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. He reached for his revolver instinctively before letting it fall back. The habit was a chain he could not break. The girl's voice came again, faint and unshaped this time, carried on the wind like a ghost. He closed his eyes, letting it settle into him. He whispered into the fire, words no one would hear but him. I came here to forget, but this place remembers. Above him, clouds gathered thick and low, carrying the smell of rain not yet fallen. The air was heavy with waiting. He felt it in his chest, the sense that the land itself was holding its breath. The river whispered, the girl's song echoed, and the night promised that whatever he had run from was already waiting on the other side of the horizon. He did not sleep. He only sat by the fire until the first light of dawn bled into the sky, wondering whether the river had carried his name to someone else's ears. Dawn settled over the valley like pale ash, washing the riverbank in muted silver. The village stirred awake with the shuffle of boots on dry ground, with the clang of tin buckets striking the edges of shallow wells. The stranger moved among them quietly, his broad shadow cast long in the new light. He drew stares wherever he went. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, men watched with narrowed eyes, and women whispered with suspicion sharp enough to cut. He gave them nothing in return. His silence was his shield, and though he carried it well, its weight was beginning to show. The girl appeared as she always did, walking barefoot toward the river, a basket slung over her arm. She knelt in the water, rinsing rough cloth, her song rising low and unhurried. The words were not clear, but the meaning seeped through, heavy with remembrance. The stranger lingered nearby, leaning against the trunk of a leaning tree, his gaze fixed on the ripples spreading from her hands. It was the only time he looked at peace, though even then it was a brittle peace, like glass threatening to crack. A rancher approached him that morning, a thick-set man with a weathered jaw and eyes that carried more judgment than curiosity. He asked the stranger where he had come from, and why he had stayed when the road stretched long and empty in both directions. The stranger answered only that he was passing through, and the rancher pressed no further. Still, mistrust hung in the air like smoke that could not be waved away. The village had grown used to hardship. They knew hunger, they knew drought, and they knew what it meant to be overlooked by lawmen who rode past their valley without pause. But danger was something else, something sharper, more unpredictable. A stranger carried the scent of danger even when he smiled, and this one did not smile. That night, the girl's voice rose again from the riverbank, but her song shifted. Where once it mourned, now it hinted of warning. The words curled into verses about riders who came with fire in their saddlebags, about towns swallowed whole by smoke. The villagers listened in uneasy silence, their gazes darting from the singer to the stranger as if her voice pointed toward him. He felt the weight of their suspicion, and bore it like a man used to carrying blame. When the last note faded, the stranger walked to the edge of the water. He asked the girl why her song carried such shadows. She replied that the river never lies, that it whispers of what is to come as much as what has been. He asked if she believed it. She said she did, because the land had never failed to speak its truth. He stared at the water then, as though the current might confess his sins to her if he lingered too long. That evening, unease thickened like the smell of coming rain. The villagers gathered in the square, their voices rising with speculation. Some swore the stranger was a deserter from one of the border wars, a man who had traded loyalty for blood money. Others claimed they remembered a face like his on a bounty sheet nailed to a saloon wall. The girl did not join their talk. She sat by the fire's edge, her silence sharper than their words. Sleep eluded him that night. Dreams came heavy with gunfire and flame, with faces blurred by smoke. He woke to the sound of his own breath, shallow and ragged, his hand gripping the revolver at his side. The fire had burned low, and the river whispered in the dark, its voice almost human. He sat with it until dawn, shoulders bent beneath the burden of memory. By morning, rumors sharpened into fear. A rider came from the ridge, his horse lathered with sweat. He spoke of a gang moving through the hills, men who burned and took what they pleased, men with no law above them but hunger and cruelty. The name they carried was one the stranger knew too well, and the moment it reached his ears his jaw tightened. He turned from the crowd, but whispers spread faster than wildfire. He recognized them. The girl found him alone at the river's bend, hands plunged into the current as though washing blood no one else could see. She asked him quietly if the rumors were true. He hesitated long enough for her to know the answer before he spoke it. They were men he had once ridden beside, men who called him brother. Her expression did not shift with judgment, only with a sorrow deep enough to make the world quieter. He confessed no details, offered no excuses. But his silence filled in the gaps, betrayals, violence, choices that had blackened his name. The girl told him the river could not cleanse what he had done, but it could carry him forward if he let it. He looked at her then, seeing not mercy but a kind of honesty sharper than any blade. The village learned the truth soon enough. The rancher spread it first, saying the stranger had once been one of them, one of the very men now coming for their valley. Fear turned to anger, and anger turned to talk of casting him out. Voices rose in the square, some demanding he be bound and left for the raiders to claim, others uneasy at the thought of driving away a man who might know how to fight them. The girl did not speak for him openly, but when her song rose again that night, it carried defiance rather than grief. She sang of rivers that carved stone, of small flames that burned against great storms. Her voice did not name him, yet it bound him to them in a way words could not. The villagers listened, torn between suspicion and the hope her melody dared to offer. The stranger stood at the edge of the crowd, the firelight catching the hollows of his face. For the first time he seemed ready to speak, but no words came. Only his silence remained, heavy as the coming thunder. When the song ended, the rider who had brought warning stood once more. He said the gang was close now, that by the next nightfall they would be upon the valley. Panic rippled through the people, mothers clutching their children, men reaching for rifles that suddenly felt too light. The stranger's eyes hardened at the news, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He turned away from the fire and spoke low enough for only the girl to hear. "I know those men, and they'll not leave this place standing." The words hung between them like smoke, leaving the night heavy with what was coming. The valley wore silence like a shroud. Every breath of wind carried the smell of dust and distant rain. Every creak of a barn door or restless hoof felt louder than it should. The villagers gathered in the square that morning, their eyes fixed on the stranger, as though his presence alone had summoned the storm now pressing at their borders. He stood with his back to them, shoulders set against the weight of their judgment, and for the first time he spoke more than a handful of words. The men coming for them were not rumors or shadows. They were real, and he had ridden with them once. A hush followed his admission, broken only by the scrape of boots shifting in dirt. The rancher, hard-eyed and trembling with anger, asked why he should be allowed to stay when his past had set their future ablaze. A woman clutching her child demanded to know if the blood on his hands would now stain their homes. He gave no defense. He simply said the truth. Those riders would not leave until they had taken everything. His voice held no plea, no excuse, only the calm certainty of a man who had seen villages burn before. The girl stood apart, her face unreadable. She did not shield him from their fury, nor did she join it. When the crowd's anger swelled, she lifted her voice, not in argument but in song. The melody was not gentle. It cut through the noise like steel through cloth. Her words were not of sorrow this time, but of rivers that outlast fire, of voices that could not be silenced by fear. The villagers stilled, caught by the sharp edge of her defiance. She gave them no orders, but her song left them with a choice, stand or scatter. That night the stranger helped them prepare. He showed the rancher how to brace a door with timber, taught the younger men to check the sight of a rifle in the low light, explained where fire would spread quickest if torches touched the rooftops. They listened with stiff suspicion, their eyes full of doubt even as their hands obeyed. He moved among them like a ghost, his silence heavier than the words he spared. Yet something in the way he worked, calm, measured, precise, hinted at a man who no longer cared about saving himself. At the riverbank, the girl found him alone, loading bullets into a worn revolver. She asked him whether he fought for them or for himself. The pause before his answer stretched long, and though he said he fought because he could not turn away again, she heard what he did not speak. This was not about redemption in the eyes of the village. It was about carrying the weight of his choices to their end. She told him the river carried stories forward, whether the teller wished it or not, and his story was not finished. His eyes softened briefly, the hardness cracking enough to show the ruin beneath. The villagers argued long after dark. Some wanted to drive him into the hills, believing sacrifice would buy their safety. Others admitted the truth they could not stomach. Without his knowledge, they had little chance of standing. Fear twisted into division, and division threatened to break them before the enemy even arrived. The girl's song rose again from the shadows, steadier than their bickering, binding them with melody even when words failed. Her voice carried over the rooftops, washing the night with a stubborn refusal to surrender. By the time she fell silent, the village had chosen, not unanimously, not joyfully, but enough. They would fight. In the hours before dawn, preparations became ritual. Fires were doused so smoke would not betray them. Cattle were herded quietly to the far end of the valley, children hidden in the stone cellar of the church. The men gripped their rifles with knuckles white. Women tied bandages from torn cloth, and the old sharpened what tools they could hold steady. The stranger walked among them, his figure half-shadowed, steady as the rhythm of boots against dust. He said little, but his presence anchored them like a stone set in a raging river. When he paused near the girl, she asked if he feared what was coming. He admitted fear had long ago left him. What remained was a hollow weight of knowing too well what battle would take. She asked if he believed they could survive. He looked at her, then at the villagers, thin-armed, weary, untrained, and said only that survival was not the same as victory. Still, he would give them both if he could. She nodded once, her expression unreadable, and turned her face toward the horizon as if listening for the echo of hooves that had not yet reached them. The sky bruised with the coming storm. Clouds pressed low, heavy with rain, and lightning flickered faintly beyond the ridge. The stranger stood at the edge of the valley, his gaze fixed on the dark line of hills. He could almost see the riders already, torches in their fists, their laughter rolling like thunder before the rain. His past rode with them, and he knew the weight of every face that would come. As the first stars blinked into the darkening sky, the girl lifted her voice one last time. The song was neither mournful nor triumphant, but something harder, sharper, a vow carved into the night itself. The villagers stilled, listening, their fear bending into resolve. Even the stranger felt it burn inside him, her voice threading through a silence like a wire drawn tight. Far across the ridge, a glow broke the darkness. Torches, scattered like fireflies, crept closer. The sound of hooves reached them then, low and rolling, a drumbeat carried on the wind. The villagers stiffened, clutching their rifles, their breaths shallow in their throats. The stranger's hand fell to his revolver, steady now, no tremor left. The first torch broke the horizon like a star torn from the sky, and then another followed, and then another, until the ridge burned with moving fire. The hooves came next, a rolling thunder that rattled the ground beneath the villagers' boots. They stood in the dark, rifles clutched tight, eyes darting toward the stranger as though his steadiness might anchor them. He did not move. His face was carved from stone, gaze fixed on the advancing glow as if staring down the past itself. The riders poured into the valley like a flood of shadows, their laughter sharp, their torches casting wild light across the brittle fields. The gang did not ride cautiously. They rode with the certainty of wolves, knowing the terror they carried. The villagers trembled, but the girl's voice rose before fear could break them. Her song cut through the night, not soft but fierce, a cry that carried across the river and the fields. It steadied hands, slowed breaths, and made men who had never fired in anger hold their rifles without shaking. The stranger gave the signal, and the first shots cracked. Torches fell to dirt. Sparks scattering, horses reared and screamed. The gang shouted, pistols flaring, and the night turned to chaos. Smoke, fire, and blood blurred together, the air thick with dust and powder. The villagers fought not with skill but with desperation, each bullet and swing of a blade born from the will to protect what little was theirs. The stranger moved through the chaos like a man stepping into a memory he had tried to bury. Each shot from his revolver was precise, measured, his face grim with recognition of every rider who fell. They had once shared his fire, his bread, his battles, but tonight he cut them down without hesitation. The weight of it showed in his eyes, yet he did not falter. This was the reckoning he had carried with him across deserts and nights without sleep. The girl did not fight with weapons, but her song never ceased. She stood by the river, voice rising above the crack of rifles, carrying through the smoke and dust. Her melody was a thread that bound the villagers together, a reminder that they were more than fear, more than prey. Some said afterward that her voice kept the bullets from breaking them, though none could explain why. In the thick of the fight, the gang's leader appeared, a tall figure on a black horse, his face shadowed but his voice unmistakable. He called the stranger by name, loud enough for the whole valley to hear, dragging his past into the open. He laughed as he dismounted, tossing aside his torch, and walked toward the stranger with the swagger of a man who believed himself immortal. The villagers froze, their fear deepening at the realization that the fight was more than survival. It was a war between two men bound by blood and betrayal. The stranger stepped forward, revolver raised, but the leader did not draw. Instead, he spoke of old days, of raids and spoils, of nights when they had sworn never to break apart. He accused the stranger of weakness, of betrayal, of abandoning the only family he had ever known. The words cut like knives, not because they were true, but because they carried echoes of the man he once was. They fought not with pistols at first, but with fists, grappling in the dirt, striking with the fury of brothers turned enemies. The village became a blur around them, shouts, gunfire, the crash of torches. But for them there was only the taste of dust, the sting of blood, the weight of years of guilt and rage. The stranger faltered, pinned beneath the leader's strength. His revolver knocked from his grip. For a moment, it seemed the past would devour him whole. Then the girl's voice rose again, sharper than before, not a song of sorrow but of defiance. It carried across the battlefield, cutting through the haze, finding him where he lay. He closed his eyes, drew strength not from rage but from the sound that refused to let him fall, and with a surge he broke free. They struggled again, but this time the stranger's hand found the revolver. The final shot rang out, echoing across the valley, and the leader fell. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of dying torches and the labored breaths of the living. The gang, seeing their leader fallen, scattered into the night, leaving behind only their dead. The villagers stood stunned, weapons still raised, unable to believe the fight had ended. Slowly, disbelief turned to relief, then to grief of those lost, and finally to the weary recognition that they had survived. The stranger stood swaying, blood running down his arm, eyes fixed on the man he had killed. There was no triumph in his face, only the hollow weight of inevitability. The girl approached him, her bare feet stained with dirt and ash, and took his hand. She led him to the river, where she knelt and washed the blood from his skin. Neither spoke. The water carried the red away, rippling it downstream until it vanished into the night. At last he whispered that her song had given him back something he thought gone forever. She asked what that was, and he answered simply, his name. She told him the river had carried it to him, not her. Her voice was only the current's echo. Dawn broke over the valley, pale and cold, illuminating the wreckage of the night. The villagers moved among the ruins, gathering the fallen, tending the wounded, rebuilding what they could. The stranger saddled his horse in silence, his body heavy with wounds and exhaustion, but his gaze steady for the first time. The girl watched him, her face unreadable, and when he mounted she did not ask him to stay. She only said that the river would remember. He rode out as the sun broke free of the horizon, casting his shadow long across the valley floor. Behind him, the girl stood by the river, singing again. This time her song carried not only sorrow but also hope, a melody that lingered in the air long after he had disappeared from sight. The river flowed on, as it always had, carrying voices and memories into the endless beyond, holding them long after the world forgot. The land was quiet once more, but it was no longer the same silence. It was a silence of survival, of wounds endured, of stories yet to be carried forward. And in that silence, her song endured,